In this section today, we're going to talk about some of the pillars of the Renaissance, some key ideas that really become prominent and what we often consider to be part of this European Renaissance that takes place. So we begin here with the idea of Renaissance humanism. And in this idea, they are searching for a new culture, new identity, and a rejection of the old culture of the Middle Ages. There's a movement away from the old language of Latin, which was the primary language where everything was written in during the Middle Ages. More people want vernacular. It's important that you grab this concept of vernacular. It means it's the language in which you speak. So for most of you, the language is going to be English, and for the people here in Europe, they had their native tongue, the one that they often spoke in, the one they're most familiar with, and so they wanted to be able to read and write and be able to have more materials that were printed in their own language. So that's why I say Latin gives way to vernacular here. There's more attention that is focused on the Greek and Roman cultures and Greek and Roman philosophy. And so therefore, they're reshaping the way that in which their culture is directed and the things that they are going to focus on during this time we call the Renaissance. There's a few new ideas about education as well. Humanistic education includes a study of the humanities. This is a broader study than what you would have seen during the Middle Ages. So this would include subjects like grammar, history, and math that are seen as more practical, and therefore they become very important. Whereas during the Middle Ages, grammar, history, and math didn't really seem to have a whole lot of value and was often put off to the side. So people didn't really learn a whole lot about that, and that's part of the reason why historians will refer to the Middle Ages as more dark ages, not necessarily because it was that bad of a time period, but more of there was not a focus on some of these humanities. And as we can see, some of the new ideas develop. Many of them come because individuals put a focus on history or math or grammar, and they go back and learn what the Greeks and the Romans thought about each one of these things. There's also a new view on history. They believe that history is important to restoring a profitable culture in the society, and so they will go back and they will revisit some of the previous cultures that had lived before them, and they will go back and look at some of the primary documents and look at how other people lived and begin to change the way that they have an outlook on life. It's also an important reason that we study history, is to look back on all the things that we can learn from other cultures that have gone before us. It is important to note here that this is not really modern humanism. Modern humanism comes more during the 1800s, and that's the modern idea is a strong attention toward glorifying oneself. So Renaissance humanism, while it did focus more on mankind and it was more man-centered than perhaps God-centered, they would still have acknowledged God as the creator. They would still have acknowledged that there was a God or that there is a God, and they would have looked to glorify him through their works of art and through their studies, but there would have definitely been more emphasis on mankind and his achievements as opposed to what we would have seen during the Middle Ages that would have been focused more on glorifying the church or simply just survival as well. In the change in Renaissance art, I think it's important for us to go back and to characterize what we would have seen during the Middle Ages. So art during the Middle Ages would have been very non-realistic, and therefore there's not a whole lot of depth and dimension to it. Most art that was created during the Middle Ages was very biblical because the church was the primary source of all the art. They were the only ones who were willing to pay anybody to create art. And they didn't pay very well, and many times they paid members of their own clergy to create this art. And so artists did not have a way to make a living during the Middle Ages. There was no incentive to do so. And there definitely was no sculpture that was created, at least not on the scale that we see in the Renaissance. That was typically not something that would have been characteristic of the Middle Ages. So a couple ways that art changed. Realism became more emphasized. to where artists are going to try to portray an image or picture or scene as realistically as possible. There's also a stronger focus on secularism. There's a movement away from simply religious scenes or images of Mary, images of Christ. Now they're going to have everyday scenes of life in the Middle Ages, town life, life in outside of town as well, but they would have always had some sort of action, and there would have been a focus on the human aspect of life. So there's a few characteristics here. Natural human body or nature was typically the focus. They try to make sure to portray humans as accurately as possible, including all of the undesirable characteristics that may be seen in there as well. Landscapes become a popular artist focus, and that's what people are willing to pay for. Linear perspective is the idea that each painting, each work of art has a dimension to it and has a focal point. And so on this particular image that you see on the screen, the focal point would be just underneath that last archway, the smallest archway, just in the center of that painting. And it seems as if everything is focused in toward that center. If we were to draw lines from the corners of the image toward that center archway, right between the two men's heads that are sitting there, they would be very linear, very creating that depth leading back toward that point on the image. So that was a characteristic that we would see develop during Renaissance art. Most of the themes were secular in nature. They were focused not on religious items, but they were focused more on things that humans would have been creating, or daily life, or the human body itself, or perhaps even landscapes. That would have been more of the theme during the Renaissance art period.